The garage doors had barely opened when the silence inside the dealership shattered into laughter, and at the center of it stood a man who looked like he didn't belong anywhere near $5 million machines. His boots were caked in dried oil, his jacket torn at the elbow, and in his calloused hand he carried a battered metal toolbox that had clearly seen more years of work than most of the people in that glass-walled showroom had been alive. He had only asked one question: could he take a closer look at the engine of the hypercar gleaming under the lights, and the answer that came back from the woman behind the desk was sharp enough to cut through the air itself. "You want $899 to touch my engine," she said, holding up a printed paper with a smirk, as if reading aloud some absurd joke meant only for her audience of grinning salesmen. The room laughed. He didn't. Before we go further into this story, if you believe in kindness, in second chances, and in people who are judged before they're ever truly seen, hit that like button, drop a comment letting us know you're watching, share this with someone who needs a little hope today, and make sure you're subscribed to Kindness Corner, because stories like this are exactly what this channel was built for. His name was Daniel Hale, and 3 years ago he had been one of the most respected master mechanics in the state, the kind of man European manufacturers flew in when a problem stumped their own factory engineers. But life has a cruel way of humbling even the most skilled hands. A car accident that wasn't his fault left his wife in a hospital bed for 8 months, drained every dollar he had saved, and quietly buried the business he'd spent 15 years building. By the time she recovered, there was nothing left but debt, a foreclosed garage, and a man who now took freelance repair jobs wherever he could find them, often arriving covered in the grime of whatever engine he'd just crawled out from under. That morning, he had gotten a call from an old friend who worked security at Meridian Motors, warning him that something was wrong with the new Velocer hypercar on the showroom floor, a faint ticking noise no one else could diagnose, the kind of sound that, left ignored, could mean catastrophic engine failure within weeks. Daniel had driven straight there, not for money, but because the car's engine was a marvel he respected, and because somewhere underneath the exhaustion, he still cared about doing right by machines other people had given up on understanding. The CEO of Meridian Motors, a woman named Vivian Cross, had built her empire on image as much as engineering, and image told her that a disheveled stranger asking to put his hands inside her flagship vehicle was either a thief or a fool. She didn't recognize his name, didn't ask why he'd come, and didn't see the quiet competence in the way he stood, weight balanced, eyes already tracing the lines of the car like he could read its pulse from across the room. To her, he was simply inconvenient, a stain on the polished marble floor of her showroom, and so she had her assistant print out the absurd policy fee, half as a joke, half as a way to humiliate him out the door without raising her voice. The salesman behind the counter laughed because she laughed, the way people do when they sense which way the wind of power is blowing. Daniel stood there for a long moment, looking at the paper, then at the car, then at her, and something in his exhaustion finally gave way to quiet resolve. He set the toolbox down gently on the marble floor, the way a man sets down something heavy after carrying it for years, and said, in a voice that wasn't loud but somehow stopped every laugh in the room, that if she wouldn't let him touch the engine, then her $5 million car would never move again, because the ticking she'd been ignoring was the early warning of a fractured timing component, and within 30 days, it would seize entirely, destroying the engine beyond repair. The room went still. Vivian's smirk faltered, replaced by something colder, the look of a woman unused to being challenged in her own building. She told him he was bluffing, that her engineers had inspected the car twice and found nothing, that a man who looked like he'd slept in a junkyard had no business diagnosing a vehicle worth more than most people's homes. But Daniel didn't argue. He simply asked her to start the engine and listen, really listen, past the roar of the exhaust, to the small rhythmic tick buried beneath it, the sound that her trained ear, conditioned to luxury and not to mechanics, had never been taught to hear. One of the technicians from the back, a young man named Carlos who had been quietly watching the whole exchange, stepped forward and admitted, almost apologetically, that he had heard something similar during a diagnostic 2 days earlier but had dismissed it as background interference, because the manufacturer's manual gave no indication anything could be wrong this early in the vehicle's life. Vivian's confidence cracked further. She looked at Daniel again, this time seeing past the grime to the steadiness in his eyes, the kind of certainty that doesn't come from arrogance but from years of being right when it mattered. Against every instinct of pride, she told him to prove it, and if he was wrong, security would escort him out and she'd make sure he never set foot near another Meridian property again. Daniel knelt beside the car without another word, opened his toolbox, and began working with a precision that silenced the room more thoroughly than any insult could have. His hands moved like they remembered a language his mouth had forgotten how to speak with confidence, gentle but sure, tracing wires and components with a focus that made the showroom's expensive lighting feel almost irrelevant. 20 minutes later, he held up a small, hairline-fractured component, barely larger than a coin, and explained quietly that it was a manufacturing defect, not something visible on any standard diagnostic, the kind of flaw only someone who had spent decades learning to listen to engines the way doctors listen to heartbeats would ever catch in time. Vivian stared at the broken piece in his palm, then at the man who had found it, and for the first time since he'd walked in, she saw him not as an inconvenience, but as the only person in that entire building who had actually been right. The silence that followed wasn't humiliation anymore, it was something closer to reckoning. Vivian asked him, quietly this time, who he was, and when Carlos finally spoke up and told her that this was Daniel Hale, the same engineer whose repair techniques were still taught in technical manuals 2 states over, something in her expression shifted from disbelief to quiet shame. She didn't apologize loudly or dramatically, she simply asked him to sit down, ordered coffee for a man she'd nearly thrown out an hour earlier, and asked if he would consider consulting for Meridian Motors permanently, not as charity, but because she had just watched him save her company from a recall that could have cost millions and irreparably damaged the brand's reputation. Daniel didn't gloat. He simply nodded, picked his toolbox back up, and said he'd think about it, because pride, even wounded pride, doesn't heal in a single conversation. But something had changed in that showroom, something deeper than a job offer, a quiet reminder that worth isn't printed on a name tag or measured by the cleanliness of someone's jacket. If this story touched your heart even a little, if it reminded you that the most overlooked people often carry the most valuable gifts, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who needs to hear that second chances are real. And before you go, do me one favor, comment the word kindness below if you believe people deserve to be seen for who they truly are, not what they appear to be.